Oh, and me too.
Good morning, Chair Krakoff. Would you like us to begin the housekeeping remarks?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for participating in today's meeting. If attending in person, please do not connect to Zoom or teleconference while in the room. And please silence all devices. Click on the globe at the bottom of your screen to select either English or Spanish. Public comment will be taken after each item. If you are in the auditorium and wish to comment, please use the iPads located in the lobby. For meetings and other locations, please complete a blue speaker card and provide it to a South Coast AQMD employee. Speakers may be limited to a total of 3 minutes or less for all agenda items. Times may be shortened to ensure all speakers can be heard. A countdown timer will be displayed on the screen for each public comment. More time will be allotted for Spanish translation that is not simultaneous. For questions or issues on making public comment, please call the public advisor at 909-396-3247. That's 909-396-3247. Please adhere to the speaker time limit and treat others with courtesy, civility, and respect. Failure to do so can result in your mic being muted or you being removed from the meeting. Be aware that this meeting is being recorded. By participating, you authorize recording of audio and visual content presented during the live event and consent to subsequent use of the recording in the public domain by South Coast AQMD.
Are we all set here? Can you hear us?
Yes, we're all set.
Okay, I'd like to call to order, please, the February 14th, 2024 meeting of the South Coast Air Quality Management District Mobile Source Committee. This is a hybrid meeting. We have an agenda before us. Why don't we start with the roll call, please?
Mayor Pro Tem McAllen,
Here.
Supervisor Mitchell,
Present.
Supervisor Perez,
Here.
Councilmember Rahman, Councilmember Rodriguez, and Chair Krakoff.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you all. Good to see all of you. Happy Friday. So we have two informational items today, colleagues, and then some written reports that are receive and file, and then public comment period. I would propose just to dive into item number one, unless there's any comments or objections from the members. Okay, hearing none, we'll start on item one, update on US EPA recent revision to the National Ambient Air Quality Standard for fine particulate matter. US EPA recently finalized a revision to the annual PM 2.5 air quality standard, reducing it from 12 micrograms per cubic meter to 9 micrograms per cubic meter. This presentation will provide an overview of this finalized action and related next steps for South Coast AQMD, And I believe we have the Deputy Executive Officer, Dr. Reese, presenting on this one. So thank you very much, Dr. Reese.
Good morning, Chair Krakoff and members of the committee. So yes, I am going to give this update today. So with that, let's dive on in. So next slide, please. Just by way of background, under the Clean Air Act, EPA is required to establish national ambient air quality standards for the criteria pollutants. There are 6 criteria pollutants. PM 2.5 is one of them. When they establish these ambient air quality standards, then all states and regions have an obligation to be able to meet them. PM 2.5 is a pollutant that is associated with very significant health risks, premature death being one of the closest connections, but also cardiovascular disease, cardiopulmonary disease, increased cases of asthma, etc. When EPA establishes national ambient air quality standards, they only consider the health impacts. They're supposed to set a standard that protects human health within an adequate margin of safety. That includes covering folks who are in sensitive subpopulations like children and the elderly. Costs are not considered when EPA goes through this exercise. EPA previously established PM 2.5 standards. They started in 1997. They also revised the annual standard in 2012. The 1997 standard was 15 microgram per meter cubed on an annual basis. We've met that standard in South Coast since 2013. The 2012 standard is 12 microgram per meter cubed. I'll be coming to this committee and to the board in a couple of months with our plan on how we're going to meet that standard. So that's more news to come on that. Next slide, please. So EPA has recently revised the annual PM 2.5 standard. This is a procedure that was pretty fraught. During the Trump administration, EPA started on a review of the PM 2.5 standard. In December of 2020, they came out with a decision to basically stand pat on the 2012 standard and keep it at 12 microgram per meter cubed, as well as keep the daily standard at 35 microgram per meter cubed. That decision was strongly criticized. The process, frankly, was very abbreviated and rushed. A lot of procedural steps were cut out, opportunities for public comment. There was criticism that the science wasn't adequately reviewed and that some studies were discarded. So in June of 2021, EPA announced that they were going to be reconsidering that December decision and start looking at the standard again. They came out with their integrated science assessment, which is a compendium of all of the scientific information that goes into a NAAQS review, as well as their policy assessment document in 2022. And then just over a year ago, they proposed to strengthen the annual PM 2.5 standard, moving it from 12, looking at a range of consideration between 9 and 10 microgram per meter cubed. They did look as low as 8, and they did also look as high as 11. Next slide, please. And where they've wound up is just last week, they finalized the standard at 9 microgram per meter cubed. Because of the significant health impacts associated with PM 2.5, we expect that there'll be very significant benefits as a result of this rule. So across the nation by 2032, which is the first year by which the moderate areas need to attain the standard, EPA estimates that there'll be 4,500 fewer premature deaths a year, as well as hundreds of thousands of fewer asthma cases, lost work days, et cetera. When you monetize and put a value on all of those health impacts, that's between $27 and $36 billion in annual monetized public health benefits across the nation. There are costs associated with compliance. EPA estimates that between $350 and $470 million in annual compliance costs, but the costs are much outweighed by those benefits. For our region, EPA estimates that there'll be $24 million in annual compliance costs for our 4-county region. That's only through 2032, they modeled that. However, at that point, we anticipate that, or at least according to EPA's modeling, we'll only be down to 12 micrograms per meter cubed in that time. So there likely will be additional compliance costs in South Coast to be able to get down to that 9 microgram per meter cubed standard. Next slide, please. So let's take a look at what our levels look like in South Coast. They have come down dramatically over the years, but we're still above that 12 microgram per meter cubed standard. Our design values are about, upper 13, low 14 right now. Again, we are working on a plan, and we'll be talking to this committee and the board later on what that looks like. And we do anticipate that we'll be able to get down to that 12 microgram per meter cubed standard without too many additional controls. However, that 9 microgram per meter cube standard is going to be very, very challenging for us to meet. Next slide, please. Looking at the implementation timeline, the EPA has recently finalized this new NACs, but there is some time to go through the process to designate and evaluate which areas don't attain the standard, and then some time to develop and implement and submit the plan. So EPA is going to go through their designation process up through February of 2026. We believe it's likely they're going to look at the data from 2021 to 2024 to make that decision of whether we attain or not. And then we'll have until August of 2027 to develop and submit the plan to EPA. Next slide, please. Attaining the EPA assumes that for the most part across the nation, reduction of direct PM 2.5 emissions is going to be enough to meet that first deadline in 2032 for those moderate areas. As you may remember, PM 2.5 is both directly emitted as well as formed in the atmosphere. We believe that for our region, direct controls is part of what we need to look at, but we also have to look at those precursors, those chemical building blocks that form PM 2.5 in the atmosphere. That calls into a question the need for mobile source controls, particularly controls from those federal sources. Happily, a lot of those strategies that we use for reducing NOx for ozone will also help on PM 2.5, but it does mean that we're going to need additional federal controls as well as what we can do in the South Coast region. You can see the map that we have here, the counties or areas in blue. Those are the regions that EPA estimates will still not attain the standard by that first deadline and will need additional controls. You can see that California is a huge chunk of that. There are also some areas kind of in the West as well as scattered across the rest of the country, but California definitely makes the lion's share of regions that are going to need those additional controls. Next slide, please. So again, the challenge is we are going to have to develop a new air quality management plan. We aren't going to be able to attain that 9 microgram per meter cube standard. That plan is going to be very, very significant. We're just on the heels of our 2022 air quality management plan, which is a very big plan where we were pivoting towards zero emission technology whenever and wherever feasible. This plan is going to be as big, if probably not a bit bigger, in terms of the types of controls we're going to need to get down to that region, that area. Also, for PM 2.5, we don't have the ability to rely on black box measures. We have to define all of our measures going forward as to how you're going to get down to that low standard. So it'll be very, very challenging. I will note that background PM 2.5 levels are about 3 to 4 microgram per meter cubed in our region. So the standard is set very, very low. We do expect significant benefits because of our NOx reduction strategies, as I mentioned before, but we will also need to do some controls of direct emissions. And so some of the control measures we might look at would be on reducing emissions from commercial cooking, on residential wood burning, high performance controls for industrial sources, as well as looking at agricultural burning programs. But again, we will have to still address federal sources in order to get down to that 9 microgram per meter cube standard. Next slide, please. There were also some additional monitoring requirements as part of this package. There were some new requirements for EJ areas, as well as additional near-road monitoring sites, and some changes on technical methods and data calculations. We already have a very comprehensive air monitoring network in place and exceed what current EPA requirements are. Staff are evaluating whether there's additional changes we need to make as a result of the new requirements as part of this package. We'll report back if there are changes that are needed. Next slide, please. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about wildfires and prescribed hot fires when we're talking about PM 2.5. Everybody's seen that wildfires have been growing in severity and magnitude, and the smoke definitely impacts PM 2.5 levels as well as public health. The Clean Air Act allows for high PM 2.5 levels as a result of wildfire to be excluded from consideration as to whether you meet the standard or not. These are called exceptional events. EPA has rules and guidance in place on what governs how you can exclude that data, but they're pretty cumbersome and bulky. We've been working with a consortium of agencies, nationally as well as with EPA to try to streamline that process, and we'll continue to try to pull tools together to work on that. But with this lower standard, going through exceptional event demonstrations and being able to flag those data is going to be of increasing importance, both for us and across the nation. EPA is also updating their air quality index as part of this package. The air quality index is a color-coded tool that translates concentrations of pollution to terms that the public can understand. So, for example, if I tell you it's 10 microgram per meter cubed of PM 2.5 today, that might not be meaningful. But if I tell you the air quality is good, that's meaningful. And so that's what the air quality index is doing. EPA is revising that to reflect the new standard. Next slide, please. So in terms of next step for us, we're going to continue to work with our partner agencies, coordinating with EPA as they develop their implementation rules for how they roll out this new standard. Continue to work with CARB on the development of a new air quality management plan. And then again, continue our advocacy work with the federal government so that get them to step up and take responsibility for those emissions that are largely causing a lot of our problems with air pollution. I believe that's it. I'll answer any questions.
Thank you very much. We'll open this up to public comment in just a moment here. Any thoughts or observations before we do from members of the committee?
Chair. Question. How many districts will have as challenging a time as we will in complying with the new standards? Do we have a sense?
I think so, certainly in California, all the California areas were noted, they're going to have a hard time. San Joaquin Valley will probably have a harder time than we will. Their design values for PM 2.5 are a little higher than ours right now. But we have some pretty high levels compared to the rest of the country. So I think we're going to be in one of the tightest spots.
And so I'm hoping that will then bring us additional allies as you outline the next step. So much of that was really trying to encourage our federal partners to understand actions we need them to take. So I'm hoping that additional districts will all join forces, if you will, in our advocacy efforts. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. There's certainly going to be some areas of the country that are facing PM non-attainment for the first time. And so that will definitely kind of highlight the issue.
One more thing, I'm sorry. If you could go back to your next step slide, does it include advocacy around asking them to expedite? I think the term you used was bulky, the wildfire kind of exclusion process. Will we be working to get them to debulk that process for us as well? Because I think that's going to be critical.
And we're continuing to work with EPA on that. I think EPA, I will say that they tend to be receptive to the issues that we raise, but they're also concerned because they want to make sure that exceptional events aren't used as a loophole that discounts valid data, right? And so I think that we're working on this tension of kind of showing our work and being able to demonstrate that no, on some of these days, the PM 2.5 is from wildfire, completely out of our control, versus things that are more man-made and can be controlled. But we will be continuing that process.
Okay, and I'm not looking for loopholes. I just want to make sure that given the continued high likelihood of California experiencing wildfires, unprecedented, I want to make sure that their process takes that into consideration. That's all. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, I heard somebody the other day.
Just
sorry.
Yeah, so Supervisor, in your previous question, you asked about other air districts and trying to garner support. CAPCOA, or the California Air Pollution Control Officers Association, is very engaged because there's a number of rural districts, and as Dr. Reese mentioned, San Joaquin, that are very concerned about this new standard and how to achieve it. So they're working very closely with CARB, with us. And then at the national level, the National Association of Clean Air Agencies is also very engaged on not only on the exceptional events tool, helping interface with the EPA and really stressing the co-regulator role and trying to finalize guidance, a number of different efforts. So I just want you to be assured that at both the state and national level, we're working to make sure that we have a consistent approach and that the federal regulators understand their role in this entire process.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, somebody the other day asked if we could call all the federal sources exceptional events I don't know if our lawyers can look into that. I see, we have folks at LA City Hall. We have Supervisor Perez out in Coachella area. Why don't we start with him, Supervisor?
Yes, thank you. Good morning.
Morning.
Chair and colleagues and staff. Thank you for the presentation. So obviously these numbers are new to us, although we knew something was coming. And you've prepared us as much as possible for the worst. And I'm wondering if we've been able to identify areas of concern throughout our district. And by doing so, reaching out to them and sitting down with industry as well as advocates on the side of coalitions that fight against air pollution to help us advocate at every level of government, but more so than anything, we can't do it alone. To be a strategic front to see whatever is possible at a federal level and see what we can come up with at a local level to try to meet the standards. I'm not sure if people would be willing to sit down across the table from each other to have honest, open conversations that are transparent. I'm not sure if people would be willing to meet halfway. But I am asking that potentially we give it a shot. Time is of the essence, and obviously we owe it to our communities to do everything we can, and that's just an idea that I just thought about in hopes that we can maybe put that together. That's my only comment and question.
Yeah. Here, Supervisor. Yeah, we just had the opportunity, and maybe Wayne wants to speak to that, of being in Washington, D.C. with the two executive officers from the ports, and Sierra Club came along, Pacific Maritime Shipping Association, ILWU, labor was also there, just a terrific coalition. And my understanding, I don't know if you want to speak to that at all, Wayne, that it was well received and very busy few days, and everybody felt good about sitting around the table on some of these topics. And that's just the start of the work. There needs to be a lot more of that. But that's exactly what Supervisor Perez is emphasizing here. And I don't know if you want to speak to that at all, Wayne?
I think maybe I misunderstood Supervisor Perez, but I thought he was referring to this particular standard and working with industry to address some of the concerns and the like as we move forward in developing a plan to address that. And if that is the case, Supervisor, if that's what you were asking, you know, the things that you're talking about are things that now that EPA has released a standard, we can actually pull in and make an estimate of how much effort is needed and what industries might be opportunities to further engage on this. So that process at the local level, we are definitely just starting. I don't know if Dr. Reese wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, Mike, I think Supervisor Perez, you also asked about kind of areas where we had preliminarily identified that there'd be higher issues. And, you know, the map that we had, I don't know if we were able to pull that back up, but showed kind of the levels of PM 2.5 in South Coast. We see the higher levels in kind of the urbanized areas around LA County, as well as the urbanized areas of the Inland Empire. As we get further out towards the desert, levels drop off fairly significantly. And so we will be, you know, focusing on working on those areas, but PM 2.5 is a regional issue, and particularly for those secondary formation, the stuff that's formed in the atmosphere. And so, yeah, this is the map that I was discussing, where the orange and the yellow areas, those are the, and then the green, those are the areas that are all above what this proposed standard are.
Yeah, you're both correct. And with my question, with your response, the only other area though is as well the nonprofits that are out there. I know you mentioned Sierra Club. But for example, like the Coalition for Clean Air, and seeing how we could, work together to try to achieve this. That's what I'm trying to get at. It's going to be a tough one, especially knowing that at the federal level, we might not get support. And so whether we do or not, we need to do everything we can to bring our sources, our colleagues, our partners together to make these changes. So I look forward to those conversations in the future. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, can I ask a naive question?
Yeah, Supervisor Mitchell just wants to make a question.
It was referenced that the cost, and I don't know if that was just to AQMD, or I think you mentioned 4 counties or 4 regions, would be 24 million to bring us into compliance.
So that's what EPA estimated, and that was 24 million just through 2032. That EPA also estimates that we'll only be down to 12 microgram per meter cubed at that point. So we will likely have additional compliance costs to get down to that 9 microgram per meter cubed level. We're not anticipating we're going to be able to meet the standard by 2032. It's going to be a longer time frame for us.
And my question is, where does that 24 million come from? Is that fines, fees? Where does that come from?
Those would the EPA likely estimated compliance costs from additional controls that industry would install, as well as additional controls from other sources like commercial cooking, for example.
Thank you.
Supervisor, anything else in Riverside there? If not, we'll go to LA City Hall. Did you raise your hand, council member?
Yes, I had a couple of questions.
Please.
So I wanted to ask a question about the background emissions number that you provided. Is our background emissions levels higher than other regions, and if so, why?
Our background is consistent with other regions. I'm looking towards my modeling folks, but I believe it's fairly consistent, at least from my experience way back in the day from my PhD work. These are typical background levels of PM 2.5.
Okay, so it's not that the levels that they're setting nationally for these standards are harder for us to meet because our background levels are naturally higher for some reason.
Correct. It's everybody in the
It's the same.
country is going to face that running up against background. It's just that we have higher levels to begin with than others.
Right. And can you remind me what are the primary sources of PM 2.5 in our air? I know you've gone over that in previous meetings, but that wasn't in this particular presentation.
So it's the PM 2.5 is both directly emitted as well as formed in the atmosphere. The PM that's directly emitted, it can come from industrial sources. Anytime there's combustion, anytime there's commercial cooking, actually is a very big piece of that. For us, brake and tire wear associated with highways is also another significant component.
Brake and tire wear, you said?
Yeah, brake and tire wear from vehicles.
Okay, and how, like, if you were to provide estimates of what percentage of our local PM 2.5 is coming from these various sources, do you have a sense, or can you point us towards that information?
We can bring more of those details back, but most of the PM 2.5 is being formed in the atmosphere. And so those chemicals that form it in the atmosphere, that's NOx, that's VOCs. It's a lot of the chemicals that we need to control anyway for ozone. And so we get significant co-benefits from that as well.
So the majority of PM 2.5 that's in our local area is not being directly emitted.
That's correct. But direct emissions are still important for us to look at. And that's the reason why when we talk about our PM 2.5 plan that I'll be coming to the committee with in a couple of months, we will be looking at direct controls as well.
And so for the indirect, the PM 2.5 that's being formed in the atmosphere, what is how do you actually reduce those?
Similar to ozone, NOx is a key component of that player in that reaction. And so reducing NOx, VOCs also play a role with that as well. It's very, very complex chemistry, but in general, we would look to reduce those precursor emissions. Ammonia also plays a role, a little lesser of a role here than in some other areas, like San Joaquin Valley. But those are the kinds of precursors that we would look at to control.
You mentioned in the presentation that a lot of these standards are going to be hard to meet in the absence of greater federal action. I wanted to just understand from you how federal action is different from or substantively, or kind of where their intervention would be substantively different from what the AQMD is trying to do through the ISR process.
Yeah, so the federal government has far more latitude to regulate and to get emission reductions from sources like ships, from aircraft, from locomotives than what we can do with ISR. ISR is an important tool and we leverage it to the extent that we can, but it's still going to have some limitations. And so, to get the volume of emission reductions that's needed to meet these standards, we're really going to have long-term federal action to regulate or some other way address those emissions, particularly from shipping and from aircraft and the locomotives.
And council member, if I could add, where EPA has the ability to impact what we're asking for is they can set regulations that directly affect emissions. We cannot set emission levels or target levels for those federally regulated sources. So it's up to the facilities in an indirect source rule to determine where they can get those emission reductions. But it's the federal government that can actually set standards that reduce those emissions. Does that help?
It seems like two different pathways to the same results, but maybe I'm not following.
The control of the emissions is probably the most straightforward,
Right.
most definitive way. An indirect source rule gives you options, and you may not necessarily get the type of emission reductions that you would through a standard.
Right, but it would still, if we were to move faster on those, or if we were to actually move forward on some of those, we would still be able to move towards some of the numbers being articulated in the new.
That's the goal, that we would be able to move forward and get emission reductions.
I will say that the scale of those emission reductions are likely going to be much, much less than what you could get from federal action. So as an example, on our warehouse rule, which we think is very successful and continue to implement that, we are getting emission reductions, but when fully implemented on the scale of 3-4 ton per year or ton per day, and we need much more. We need like over 100 ton per day of emission reductions.
Right. Okay, that's useful. Okay, thank you.
Good discussion there. San Joaquin, my understanding is, has a noticeably more substantial problem with PM 2.5 than we do. What are their sources out there? Is it the agriculture sources and windblown dust, ammonia? What's their issue out there in addition to ours?
Agriculture is definitely the key player, I think, for San Joaquin Valley, and a big difference between, the nature of our problem versus what they have.
All right. I was asked that question. We got the proposed disapproval of our contingency plan for ozone. We have this issue for PM 2.5. Certainly have our work cut out for us here. And again, you can see why we're pushing on things like the ISR. It just doesn't seem to me that we have a choice given all of these situations, and do appreciate our efforts to work in coalition and push our federal partners to figure out a solution here to the desperate problems we have in meeting attainment. And this is just another one. Anything further from the committee members before we go to the public? Mayor McCowan, anything from you there in the hall?
Yes,
in the auditorium?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Reese, I know the roadside monitors, et cetera, pick up on PM 2.5, I assume. Be interested to find out what the trend has been over, is it picking up more PM 2.5 and at what levels? If you could provide that information, it would be interesting because as you and I have talked, heavier electric vehicles become, the more PM 2.5 is going to be generated, and it would be interesting to see what the trend has been.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great question, and it's something that we actually think a lot about here too. So I'd be happy to bring that data back when we, we'll be talking about the PM plan. The near road monitor, that is, the one off Route 60, that is a very high site for us. And so and it's the reason why we have to do this new plan is because there's this near road monitoring data, which is showing high levels. So perhaps I can bring that back in when we talk about the PM plan and have more of an in-depth discussion then.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll take this one. Not seeing any other hands to public comment on this item. Can we open the queue, please? Having a little trouble seeing it there, but if someone can call the names for me, please, and start the timer. 3 minutes on items combined.
Fernando can go ahead.
Good morning, Fernando Gaitan with Earth Justice, and thank you, Chair, and thank you, Dr. Reese, for this update, this very sobering update on the PM 2.5 rule. Something we've known for some time. This rule obviously is slated to address some very serious health consequences from PM 2.5. So the rule is certainly one that's urgent, one that we've known about for some time, and a problem that the region definitely needs to tackle. And what this announcement from EPA does is really advances the timeline. And so I'm pleased to hear from staff that they are going to work diligently to address this issue and in fact also strengthen the AQMD. And we stand ready to work with staff to make sure that the next slate of rules are strong and deliver the results that the region needs. And one thing that's been mentioned throughout this this hearing today is the issue of the indirect sources rule. We are pleased to also see, and we thank staff for their approach to the upcoming working group meetings, providing a structure for that conversation to lead us to actual rule making and rule implementation, and keep us to a timeline because that rule is long overdue. Both the port indirect sources rule as well as the rail indirect sources rule. So we are very pleased to see staff working diligently to make sure that rule gets completed this year. And we are ready to sit at the table with all stakeholders to really think through a comprehensive strategy for addressing indirect sources at the ports. This rule is going to be very important, not only for the reasons we heard today, but also because they've been long overdue and long part of the district's toolkit in addressing not just PM 2.5, but the other sources of emissions that we care about and need to reach attainment on. So thank you for this presentation. We hope to continue working with staff to make sure both the rail yard and Port ISR get completed in a timely fashion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Next
you.
speaker, we believe, is Harvey Etter, the number ending in 524.
Good morning. Am I being heard?
Yes, you are, Harvey.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the presentation and good morning, board. One thing that Dr. Reese has said in the past is that a PM 2.5, NOx and VOC precursors for O3, for ozone, okay? She said 2/3 of PM 2.5 are part of precursors to NOx. Okay, that's very significant. Let's keep that in mind. They were using low numbers like 1/3 before, okay? When they say they're going to save 45,000 premature deaths a year by doing this, Okay, right now they're only admitting to like about 50,000 for the whole country. And the state of California used 7,500, and 4,000 or 5,000 of that goes to South Coast. Okay, the premature deaths have gone and cost. Now I heard a $24 million per year figure on this. I don't know what it means, but I want to know based on deaths per 1,000. It went from 20 years ago about 3 million to now 12 million. In the 16 plan, it was 9 million. So if we were looking at 5,000 deaths in South Coast at 9 million in the 16 plan, roughly $50 billion a year. Okay, and that was about was allowed for fuel costs. That was in the 16 plan. So. Lancet magazine in 18 said there was 1.1 to 1.5, 1.5 premature deaths each year in this country. 10% of that, and we're 12% of the country, is 110 to 150,000. So we're up at 100. So we've got orders of magnitude. The deaths are many, many times more. Lancet's been around 200 years, out of London. They're pretty much the state of the art. Now, the Chan School, Harvard, they more recently had a paper a couple of years ago. They were using 1/3 of a million. So 350,000 is a lot different than 50. But and that's being challenged. The deaths are 9-10 million plus per year from air pollution, and this is coming into other things with Hansen's recent paper with interaction of taking away from shipping sulfur, and it hurts health but helps climate reflectivity in clouds. Anyway, we got big problems in Hansen. Anyway, we can do this with solar. We have the Solar New Deal, and it was in there. It was totally ignored. That's the Sunshot program of the DOE. There's money there. You're hiding the money, both y'all and EPA, that there's several $1 million that have gone for planning, and we need that to redo the 16 plan. But the best, you have gross negligence. All right? So this stuff's...
Thank you, Harvey. Our next speaker is Yazi Kavzavadeh.
And let's close the queue, please.
Good morning, everyone. This is a big deal, and I just wanted to uplift what Fernando was saying, really appreciating staff working hard despite lots of folks dragging their feet on the possibility that indirect sources rules could be complementary to achieving lower PM 2.5, ozone, and other pollutants we're battling every single day. In our DC trip, we were there when EPA decided to take on this rule. At Sierra Club, we're calling it the soot rule. So just wanted to encourage staff to continue to be innovative in your rulemaking process and use this as an opportunity to leverage more at the federal government. We support that. We support stronger mandates and stronger rules on emissions like ships, trucks, and other off-road locomotives that can help us for the future. And we should look to the state as well on their rulemaking process. I think the power you all have is how do we design the infrastructure and end use behavior change at the industry level for things that we can't regulate. So I'm looking forward to taking on facility-based measures and other opportunities that grow community engagement. I really appreciate what the Supervisor Perez said about engaging communities out out all over the region, especially in the East Coachella Valley, where he's from. We have AB 617 structures, like we have environmental justice coalitions. I think now it's time to just put pen to paper and air monitoring to the people and get to work. So just really appreciate you all taking this very seriously. Just know the public is awaiting action, and we're here to support whatever action you all do to create a better standard for all. Thank you so much.
Okay, so that's it for the online commentators. We have Thomas Jelenich from Pacific Maritime Shipping Association here in person at LA County. So he's going to stand up, and when he starts talking, we'll start his 3 minutes.
Just from where I am,
Where does he speak from?
to the council.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Good morning, Chair Krakoff, committee members. Thank you for your time this morning. It's so much has already happened this week. It's hard to imagine that just last week we were in DC with AQMD, with Sierra Club, Pacific Environment, ILWU, advocating for federal funds to come to this region. And I think we heard it really well from Executive Officer Nastri and DEO Sarah Reese. The clearest, most effective way to reduce emissions from PM 2.5 precursors is federal action on these sources. And so I would strongly encourage that we continue the joint advocacy that we have started in Washington and continue to work for federal action to reduce emissions from federal sources. That is the single most effective way that we will bring this region into attainment, both for ozone and PM 2.5. And we remain deeply concerned that an ISR will only limit port growth while not being the most effective way to reduce emissions. So I'm happy for the partnership we've begun with the district, and I look forward to continuing to work with all of you on bringing clean air to our region. So thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. All right, we'll bring it back to the committee members. Any comments from committee members at our various locations? Okay, so that takes us then to the next item. Item 2, Coachella Valley Contingency Measure State Implementation Plan revision for the 2008 8-hour ozone standard. The Clean Air Act requires contingency measures to be in place in case a non-attainment area fails to meet any applicable milestone or fails to attain an air quality standard by the attainment date. In response to changing policy guidance from US EPA, staff has developed a draft contingency measure plan for the state implementation plan for Coachella Valley. This presentation will present an overview of this draft plan. Again, this is a no motion required item. And on this one, we have Sang-Mi Lee, hello, Planning and Rules Manager.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee and public. So this item is Coachella Valley Contingency Measure State Implementation Plan revision for the 2008 8-hour ozone standard. Next slide. So Coachella is extreme non-attainment area for 2008 ozone standard. And non-attainment area comes with multiple planning requirements. One of them is contingency measure, and this presentation is going to address contingency measure developed for the 2008 8-hour ozone standard for Coachella Valley. I'd like to have your attention that this item is different from the contingency measure plan that EPA recently proposed to disapprove. The contingency measure plan subject to EPA's disapproval is for different standard and different area. That is for South Coast Air Basin and 1997 8-hour standard. And one more thing is that this item has been presented to CVAC meeting last week. Next slide. So ozone levels in Coachella has been improved significantly past 4 decades. There have been a little bit slowdown in the progress in recent years, which is mostly due to adverse meteorology. There is good news, which is the 1-hour ozone has met in Coachella Valley as represented in red line, and 8-hour ozone is very close to meet one of the 8-hour standard. Next slide. So high levels of ozones in Coachella Valley is heavily influenced by the transport from South Coast Air Basin. As we all know, South Coast Air Basin has the worst ozone pollution in the entire nation. Next slide. There are 4 federal ozone standards. Coachella is in extreme non-attainment area for all 3 8-hour ozone standards. And as we mentioned, that it's in attainment for 1 hour. This presentation refers to 2008 standard as marked here. Next slide. So there are multiple requirements for contingency measure. One of them is the rule has to be ready to implement without further significant actions by state or EPA. And also it has a specific timeline. So it needs to become effective within 60 days and achieve emission reductions within 2 years from the triggering event. And the amount of emission reduction to be achieved by contingency measure is also set by EPA. That is called roughly 1 year's worth of progress. If contingency measure is expected to achieve less than that threshold amount of reduction, then it needs to be supplemented with additional justification. In reality, areas like Coachella Valley or South Coast Air Basin, which are in extreme non-attainment area for ozone, we already enacted all feasible measures. Therefore, there is little to no further opportunity for contingency measure. Next slide. So contingency measure is one of many SIP requirements, and it is an additional measure required if a non-attainment area fails to meet the standard by the due date or make a further reasonable progress toward attainment. And this measure has to be above and beyond all existing measures. Next slide. There is a little bit of a past action regarding this element. So we developed an attainment plan that includes a contingency measure and submitted to EPA in 2017. Since then, there have been multiple adverse lawsuits against the EPA, which made EPA to revise its policy on the contingency, and they set new requirements as a result. And of course, the submitter we did not address these new requirements. Therefore, we withdrew them to avoid potential disapproval. Now we have to develop the new measure and submit to EPA. Next slide. This item has a sanction clocks and federal implementation plan implications. So since we withdrew the submitted portion, EPA issued a notification that we failed to submit. That was October 2022. Since then, we developed a contingency measure. We released it for public comments and review last month, and there are sanction clocks. So if we do not submit this plan on time, April of this month, the first sanction, stationary source permit sanction can kick in. 6 months later, second one, federal highway sanction can kick in. Also, EPA can promulgate a federal implementation plan. However, I'd like to have your attention that this sanction can be avoided if this package developed, submitted to EPA, and then EPA find the submitter is complete. Next slide. We found an opportunity for contingency in Rule 463. This rule applies to all above ground organic liquid tanks. We are currently amending the rule to include the contingency measure component. If triggered, this contingency measure require more frequent inspection of those tanks using optical gas imaging technique to detect any potential leak and repair them, if any. Working group meetings are ongoing. We plan to bring this to board consideration in early summer. Next slide. There are certain approaches that EPA set out for contingency measure. The first one, you have to evaluate thoroughly all the sources of emission and then identify rules that apply to them. And then next step is you compare those rules with the rules of other non-attainment area, district, and states. And then step 3 is to start from those identified measures and see if they can serve as contingency, especially in the context of economical feasibility and technological feasibility. Lastly, you estimate the reductions anticipated from those measures. If the reduction is less than the threshold amount, it needs to substantiate it with a supplemental analysis. Next slide. So the threshold amount of emission reduction is so-called 1 year's worth of reduction. We have used the latest available inventory and identified the amount. And also our estimate is the Rule 463 contingency component will achieve less than the threshold amount. Therefore, we conducted additional analysis to identify whether there is any more opportunity for contingency, and our analysis says there is really none. Next. So this is about that additional analysis. We have gone through all the sources under our purview thoroughly. That includes industrial sources, residential sources, commercial and indirect sources. The reality is, as you mentioned, we have already enacted all feasible measures for attainment. But still, throughout this process, we identified a couple of potential measures. However, they turned out to be infeasible to serve as contingency because they are not there are technological limitations, and the timeline, they do not meet the timeline to implement the contingency measure. Next slide. So this is a general timeline of a contingency measure public process. So as mentioned, we released the draft for public review last month. We conducted 2 public consultation meetings, and today is actually the close of public comment, and then also we're reporting to the committee. We'll bring this for board consideration next month, and then subsequently submit to CARB and EPA. Next slide. So this is brief summary of this presentation. So Coachella Valley is extreme non-attainment area. So we developed a contingency measure, and we consider Rule 463 to include this contingency component. And this item will be brought to board consideration next month. This concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Sang-Mi, for the presentation. So we've got this contingency measure requirement. We've looked at all the things that are feasible to satisfy the requirements of it. And what we found is one measure, organic liquid storage, and that there's nothing else feasible that can meet the particular requirements. That's what I'm distilling from the presentation. And it's going to come to our board in summer. Anything here from Supervisor Mitchell? We'll start with Supervisor Perez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, colleagues. And thank you for the presentation that is tough to swallow and sounds grim. And like, I know we've attempted in so many different ways to reach attainment and the levels we need to, but it just seems very, very difficult. You know, I do look forward to hearing from folks on the ground as well as staff as to what potentially can be done on this front. That's going to be helpful, I guess, to some degree. I'm wondering if there's any data that talks a little bit about public health concerns. For example, just yesterday at the Sansi Authority meeting, we had discussions around PM10 and talked to another air quality management district out in Lake Owens and how they have monitors, but there was also and what they're doing to achieve their efforts in that area. But there was also a doctor from UCR that was talking about nosebleeds, asthma, respiratory illnesses, and the fact that they still need to gather more data to figure out where the correlation may be, if there is any, with the issue of ozone or the issue of dust in the air and that people are breathing in. I do feel that it's important that we also touch base with those individuals at the university level to help guide us, provide us that data to support us in hopes of more funding or incentives that we can provide industries down here, as well as nonprofits that are working to keep our air clean. All that is to say that This is a tough one. People are looking towards us for answers. And I'm just wondering, are we missing something here? Or once again, is this an issue of EPA? I'll leave it at that for the meanwhile, and in hopes that potentially there could be some sign of hope with the response.
Thanks, Supervisor Perez. So one thing, first, I just wanted to clarify that on this contingency measure, we will be coming to the board in March of this year. So that's coming up very quickly, not the summer. But then, I think, so some of your question, I remind you that this is a plan on ozone in Coachella Valley for ozone. We do believe we're actually going to be on track to be able to meet the standard in Coachella, not in South Coast. And so this contingency measure, if we meet everything, it would never actually be triggered. So the picture on ozone in Coachella is a little better than what we have in South Coast. We do think we're on a path to be able to eventually attain that standard.
That sounds great. What would you say would be a timeline that's realistic for that?
Yeah, I think right now, I think the deadline is 2031, and we project that we're going to be able to meet it by then.
Okay, that being the case, obviously, I think that's a message that we need to start thinking about delivering and share that as a victory on behalf of AQMD and others that are being helpful. Just want to put that out there because obviously there's going to be other issues of concern. And I think the more we're able to tell our story and successes with the efforts of partners, the better. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor. LA City Hall.
Hi, I had a question about the timeline for this. What we're submitting. If I'm understanding correctly, we had an initial proposal that was withdrawn in June of 2022. And the deadline for the approval for this is April of 2024. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So is it likely that our proposal will be even reviewed before April 30th? It feels like the timeline is so short for this.
Right. I mean, that's an excellent question. We have to submit it by that time, and EPA has to determine that the submission is complete, not necessarily approved in that timeline.
And then what is the timeline for them responding to the content of the submission, talking about, that these are infeasible and these are feasible? Like there is a chance that they will disagree with the assessment of feasibility and infeasibility of various measures. Is that correct? Or you don't anticipate that?
So EPA has a year to then render their decision on the substance of the submission. We have been working with Region 9 staff pretty closely. This is one of the first submissions using an infeasibility analysis. And so, we're kind of breaking new ground here to some extent, but we have been in close contact with Region 9 as we've developed this.
And so you feel like the infeasibility analysis will be acceptable to them or seen as an appropriate assessment?
We believe so based on the conversations that we've had. And again, we've been in very close contact with them.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councilmember Rahman. So just a time check. This is it's about 10 o'clock. I have to leave at 10:15 if we go later than that. Supervisor Mitchell has graciously agreed to chair the meeting here. On this one, any other comments from members of the committee before we open it up for public comment? Okay, so let's open the queue. Thomas, did you want to speak on this one? Okay, nothing here in person. So we'll open up the queue and take the first commenter.
Mark Abramowitz is the first commenter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Mark Abramowitz. I'm with Community Environmental Services. And I think that you ought to be aware that even though the 1 hour I'm sorry, the 8-hour ozone standard has been met, and the 1-hour ozone standard, federal standard, has been met. The state standard has not been met. I think anytime that staff tells you that something is infeasible, you need to look carefully. And I can't help to go back 40 years. This is the 40th anniversary of my SIP lawsuit, where staff said, it's infeasible for us to meet air quality standards. And we've proven that we can get much farther than staff says. And along those lines, at the workshop on this, I laid out a number of different items that staff could easily include as part of contingency measures that could reduce emissions. And I'm sure I'm not the only one that can come up with additional measures. So I really look askance at efforts for staff to make an infeasibility analysis. Instead, they ought to be pressing for more aggressive measures to improve the health of people in the Coachella Valley. Lastly, I wanted to say that, it requires a public hearing to adopt a plan or a portion of a plan. But yet staff and management of the district seem to be able to withdraw a plan or a portion of a plan without coming to the board and having a public hearing on it. And I tend to think that that's questionable policy, whether it's legal or not. Anyway, thank you very much, and we'll see how staff comes back and responding to the additional measures that I've proposed and hopefully others have proposed also. Thank you.
Yeah, that issue about withdrawing the plan has come up at CARB as well. Okay, any other comments here on this one?
There's no one else signed up online?
Okay, we'll close the queue. Anything further from the committee members or any follow-up on the public comment before we move on? Mr. Abramowitz, if you have other feasible ideas, you can send those to the board members. We'll take a look at it and certainly ask you to re-engage with staff on that point. Thank you. So I'm going to now go to the written reports, the receive and file items, 3 through 5. This includes an update on the warehouse rule, but I think we're getting a more comprehensive presentation on that, I think in April perhaps. Anything on items 3 through 5 from the board members? And do we have to take public comment on these?
Yes, that's correct.
Can we take them as a group?
As long as we don't act on them before we take public comment, yes.
Okay, so we'll open up the queue on items 3 through 5 if there's any public comment. Tom? Okay, so we'll close that queue, and items 3 through 5 are just receive and files. So we can move on, council?
Yes, that's correct.
Number 6 is other business. Anything from the board members or staff on other business? When do we expect to get further updates on our port and rail activities at this committee?
April.
So we'll look for that meeting. Okay, that takes us to a general public comment. This is for items that are not on the agenda. We'll open it up for general public comment at this time.
There's no hands online?
Okay, we'll close the public comment unless Mr. Jelinich or anyone else in person. Not at this time. So we'll close the public comment period. That takes us to adjournment. And the next meeting date would be March 15th, 2024. And we will see you then. Everyone have a good weekend and maybe a 3-day weekend for some folks, right? And be healthy, all of you. Thank you.